Have you ever wondered if a single human ear is worth starting a decade-long international conflict that kills 25,000 people? Actually, in the 18th century, the answer was a resounding yes. The year was 1731, and the Caribbean was essentially a giant waterlogged crime scene where everyone was stealing from everyone else. Captain Robert Jenkins, a British mariner who was likely trading things he shouldn't have been, was stopped by the Spanish Coast Guard. The Spanish commander, evidently having a very bad Monday, didn't just seize the cargo, he tied Jenkins to a mast and sliced off his left ear. He then allegedly handed the severed body part back to Jenkins and told him to go show it to King George II. It was the ultimate return-to-sender message, delivered with the kind of surgical precision you only get from a frustrated colonial bureaucrat with a sharp sword and zero HR oversight.
Worst unboxing video ever.
For 7 long years, Jenkins kept that leathery, pickled ear in a jar like a cursed souvenir from a trip to the beach. Britain, meanwhile, was itching for a fight because Spain was being unreasonable about letting the British Empire monopolize global trade. In 1738, Jenkins finally walked into the House of Commons, pulled out his shriveled anatomy, and basically said, "Look what they did to my boy." The British public, who usually didn't care about the plight of sailors, suddenly became obsessed with this one specific ear. It wasn't about the ear, of course. It was about the fact that Spain had touched British property without a permit. The outrage was deafening, mostly because the British Parliament was looking for any excuse to stop Spain from checking their metaphorical pockets in the West Indies.
Forbidden jerky for the king.
By 1739, the War of Jenkins Ear officially kicked off, proving that the British would literally rather fight a world power than attend a therapy session about their colonial greed. They sent Admiral Edward Vernon to the Caribbean with a fleet and a massive ego. His first stop was Portobello in modern-day Panama, which he captured with surprising ease. This minor victory sent London into a frenzy of nationalistic pride, leading to the composition of "Rule Britannia." It's a bit ironic that one of the most famous patriotic anthems in history was inspired by a guy who lost a piece of his head while likely smuggling illicit sugar. The British felt invincible, forgetting that the Caribbean isn't just made of sandy beaches and rum, but also of very angry mosquitoes carrying very lethal diseases. The British decided their next logical step was to attack Cartagena de Indias, the crown jewel of Spanish defenses. They showed up with 186 ships and nearly 30,000 men, which was the largest naval mobilization in history until World War II. Admiral Vernon was so confident he actually had commemorative medals minted before the battle even started, celebrating his victory over the Spanish. It's the 18th century equivalent of printing Super Bowl champions t-shirts for the team that ends up losing by 40 points in the first quarter. Vernon was convinced that the Spanish commander, Blas de Lezo, a man who was missing an eye, a leg, and an arm, would simply fold under the pressure of British politeness and cannons.
Pre-ordering the win is bold.
Blas de Lezo, known as Half-Man because he was basically a collection of scars held together by spite, did not fold. He used the geography of Cartagena to turn the British invasion into a literal meat grinder. The British troops had to deal with massive stone walls, heat that could melt lead, and the realization that their ladders were too short for the fortifications. While the British were fumbling with their equipment like a DIY project gone wrong, the Spanish were raining fire down on them. It turns out that having all your limbs isn't nearly as important as having a fort that is taller than your enemy's hardware store supplies. Vernon's massive fleet was suddenly looking like a very expensive collection of targets sitting in a very hot bathtub.
Measure twice, invade once.
If the Spanish cannons didn't kill you, the yellow fever certainly would. The British camps became a biological disaster zone where soldiers were dropping faster than the value of a severed ear in a crowded room. At one point, They were losing hundreds of men a day to the black vomit, which is exactly as charming as it sounds. The medical understanding of the time was basically, have you tried bleeding the patient until he feels better? Which, unsurprisingly, did not help with a viral infection. Vernon and the land commander Wentworth spent most of their time arguing and blaming each other for the mounting body count, while their men turned into piles of feverish corpses.
Essential oils wouldn't help either.
After months of failure, the British finally limped away from Cartagena, having lost about 10,000 men and most of their dignity. To make matters worse, news reached London that the victory medals Vernon had minted were now just expensive paperweights. The government tried to suppress the news of the defeat, which is the classic political move of, if we don't talk about it, maybe the dead people will come back. The war eventually merged into the much larger War of the Austrian Succession, because Europe couldn't go more than 5 minutes without a continent-wide brawl. The ear of Jenkins had successfully set the world on fire, and then everyone kind of forgot why they started smelling smoke in the first place.
The ultimate one-star Yelp review.
In the middle of all this madness, there was the voyage of George Anson, who was sent to harass Spanish interests in the Pacific. This trip was a disaster of biblical proportions. Anson started with nearly 2,000 men across several ships, and returned 4 years later with only 188 survivors. Most of the crew died of scurvy, a disease that literally makes your old scars open up and your teeth fall out because you haven't eaten a lemon in 6 months. It was a floating horror movie, where the ending was just a few rich guys getting some gold while the peasants dissolved into salt water. Anson did manage to capture a Spanish treasure galleon, though, which made the British government pretend the whole 90% casualty rate thing wasn't a big deal.
Lemons, the original Bitcoin.
Back in the American colonies, the war played out in Georgia and Florida. James Oglethorpe, the founder of Georgia, decided he wanted to kick the Spanish out of St. Augustine. He gathered a ragtag group of settlers and indigenous allies and went on a road trip to Florida, which is a mistake people still make today. The siege of St. Augustine was a total failure because the Spanish fort was made of coquina, a type of stone made of crushed seashells that basically swallowed British cannonballs like they were marshmallows. After weeks of shooting at a wall that refused to break, Oglethorpe got tired. The Spanish launched a counterattack, and everyone went home feeling very humid and very stupid.
Florida Man, the prequel.
The Spanish eventually tried to invade Georgia in the Battle of Bloody Marsh. This sounds like a metal album cover, but it was mostly just people hiding in bushes and shooting at each other in a swamp. The British won that round, mostly because the Spanish got confused by the terrain and decided that Georgia wasn't worth the mosquito bites. By 1748, when the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed, the borders in the Americas hadn't moved an inch. Thousands were dead, millions of pounds were spent, and the Spanish still got to search British ships. It was the most expensive stay-in-your-lane lesson in human history.
All that for a stalemate.
When you look back at the War of Jenkins Ear, you realize it represents the peak of human absurdity. A guy loses an ear in a scuffle, keeps it in a jar for 7 years, and uses it as a political prop to justify a global conflict. It's like starting a bar fight because someone looked at your coaster the wrong way and then accidentally burning down the entire neighborhood. The ear itself has been lost to history, likely tossed into a bin or misplaced during a move, which is a fitting end for a piece of cartilage that caused more damage than a modern drone strike. History isn't written by the victors. It's written by the people who managed to keep their body parts long enough to complain about it.
Should have just used LinkedIn.
The lesson here is simple. If someone cuts off your ear and tells you to show it to the king, maybe just go to a doctor instead. Or at the very least, don't keep it in a jar for nearly a decade. The British Empire spent a fortune and sacrificed an entire generation of sailors over a grudge and some bad trade math. Today, we remember the war mostly for its ridiculous name, a name coined by an 18th century historian who clearly knew a good punchline when he saw one. Robert Jenkins lived out his days in relative obscurity, probably wondering if the jar on his mantelpiece was really worth the 20,000 ghosts he left behind in the Caribbean.
Worst souvenir in British history.
If you enjoyed this absurd chapter of human history, don't forget to like and subscribe. Click the top left video to explore another unbelievable historical failure. We'll see you in the next disaster. Thanks for watching.